How's it going? So let's take a look at some of these important names here and some of the works that they wrote. I'd like to remind you to do more research on these. I'm going to mention some names and some works and briefly go over some of the main points. But we want to always remind you, please, to read the supplementary readings, do additional internet searches, and just keep some of these names in sync along the patterns of the development of what we're doing. So the first person we're going to look at here is Cadwallader Colden. I put him in here because even though he wrote this text before this particular period, he was connected to the development of what's going on and his relationship to a lot of the founding fathers, or Ben Franklin at least. So he was a lieutenant governor of the state of New York. Like a lot of the other writers of the time, you could see how he was involved in science, connected to the Enlightenment. He was a physician and a scientist himself. He wrote on botany and science, and he had a long time epistolary relationship with Ben Franklin. So epistolary means correspondence. They wrote each other a lot of letters, and Ben Franklin was impressed by his work. Here's a picture of him. You could see the changes in the way people dress and the changes in colors used. And he's leaning on a piece of paper there, just a lot of the imagery seen, the iconography of the paintings, a lot of the pictures we're seeing is important to follow in this development. So he wrote the history of 5 Indian nations when he was appointed as first colonial representative of the Iroquois. So this is important because, it's important to focus on how the Native Americans were treated and how a lot of the different racial groups were treated along the development of the United States, and this we're going to see with a lot of different writers. But this is an interesting work here because even though it was written, like I said before, the time we're looking at, his relationship with a lot of the other people is important. Ben Franklin. This is a name we all know. Printer, publisher, scientist, inventor, diplomat, author. His diversity is incredible. One of the most incredible Americans for his inventions, as a scientist, his writings, his contributions. This picture that a lot of us have seen of him on the $100 bill. And Ben Franklin was definitely influenced by the Enlightenment. His style of memoir was a radical change from previous memoirs. When we look at the Puritan spiritual autobiographies, for example, they always talk about the self and talk about the self in relation to God and self in relation to being a good Christian. But his perspective on the self is more worldly and less deterministic. So determinism is when things are laid out for you, kind of like predestination. You're supposed to do this and this because it was, God had a plan for you. So like we looked at with deism, there's less determinism and people can basically develop their own life and find happiness in this world and in the here and now. This is connected with the Enlightenment and the idea of personal autonomy and human rationale and reason more than direct words from the Bible, from the words of God, and it's more based on the self and a lot of the scientific thought that's brought forth through the Enlightenment. So in regard to Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, this was written in a couple of different phases. His autobiography is one of the most popular ones written in America, partially because of his contributions to science and politics and the development of the United States as a nation, but also because he's just a very interesting individual. His style of writing, his epistolary relationships with so many different people, his travels, very, very interesting individual. but also for the focus of what we're looking at, we want to look at the difference of how this is more of a work from the Enlightenment than it is from the previous works. So in this particular text, there are very parts to this. He talks about himself as a youth, as a publisher. That's kind of his main breadwinning cause there, of being a publisher in America. And, you know, he had some problems, difficulties at the beginning, but then he was a very successful publisher later on. And in this, he talks about his errors of youth, and he called them his errata, the errors of youth. But he strived for moral perfection by trying all of these different virtues. And there's an extended list of these, but some of them are listed up here. Silence, frugality, chastity, humility, moderation, are just a few of them. So, you know, this is kind of similar to the spiritual autobiography in that same sense that, you know, there's fallen and then, you know, found grace through God. But, you know, this is interesting because he talks about the errata, you know, the errors of youth, as, you know, the Puritans would discuss the errors of sin. But then he on his own accord comes through and, you know, tries one virtue after another on his own accord and comes through this sense of self-discovery through practice and through self-examination. He also wrote The Way to Wealth. So this is an essay that he wrote back in 1758. It was a collection of work that was originally published in Poor Richard's Almanac. But the reason I'm pointing this out is because there's a lot of popular sayings today that come from it. I'm sure you've seen some of these. There are no gains without pain. You know, this kind of connected to a lot of what people say about working out today. You know, no pain, no gain. One today is worth two tomorrows. You know, get today done. If you can get something done today, then it's better off for you in the long run. Early to be, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. This is a saying that, you know, I grew up with, and maybe it's why I get up at 4 o'clock every morning. But anyways, it's, you know, these are some very famous, just a couple, but there's a long list of these. You might want to do some research to find some of the other ones that are interesting, either because you might recognize them or because they're just very wise sayings. Let's take a look here at Elizabeth Ashbridge. I'm putting her in here because it's important to recognize the contributions of all types of writers, all types of genres, all types of backgrounds, all types of you know, ways of writing. And we're not just talking about the founding fathers here. We need to include poets and the writers of their memoirs and the essays and all different types. So she was a Quaker woman with an independent spirit. She broke from her Anglican roots because she wanted more respect of women. So she wanted to go to America. So she was an indentured servant, but she wasn't. An indentured servant is when you, someone pays your way to go, and you're basically under contract to work for a particular amount of time to buy your freedom or buy your way out of. And it was very difficult for a lot of people to go through, and she had some difficulties in that herself. But she became a Quaker minister in 1738, and then she returned to Europe on a trip, I think it was to Ireland, and did die actually quite young. But her spiritual autobiography that she wrote, that was entitled Some Account of the Forepart of the Life of Elizabeth Ashbridge, it follows the typical format of this genre. I think I mentioned this before, but it's good to see this: the sins in youth, an awakening, cycles of faith, and final conversion and salvation. So, yes, we've got this developing. We've got some Quaker ideas now, which are moving along simultaneously with the Enlightenment, and a lot of the ideas that are moving away from religion. But we have to keep in mind that all of these are different types of contributions to American letters, and that one thing doesn't necessarily exclude another from from existing. So a lot of these things will exist at the same time. But let's take a look at what she says at the beginning. So she quoted here, she wrote, "My life, having been attended with many uncommon occurrences, I have thought proper to make some remarks on the dealings of divine goodness with me." So, this follows a lot of the patterns we've seen, but it's just important to see her role as, even though she didn't really break into radical feminism as we might describe it today, it's, she did break from her roots, and she did make an effort, and she did become a minister, and she did contribute to some writing. And, she had a strong faith, and this is her contribution to our letters. John Woolman, he wrote the Journal of John Woolman, is his legacy. And here's a picture of him here. But he was an interesting fellow because he lived as a Quaker, as did our previous writer. And his writing was similar to theirs, but different in some ways because, he wrote, as a Quaker, he rejected slavery. He promoted peace and simplicity. And, what's interesting about him was he didn't, the clothes he wore, the stuff that he used, he made sure that it wasn't a product of slave labor. So he was making his life consistent with the way he believed, which is an interesting, to put this into practice. We also see here some of the anti-slavery ideas coming through right now, especially with this fellow. We've got Samson Occom here. He wrote a short narrative of my life in 1768, but it wasn't discovered until 1982 in a library, I think it was in Dartmouth College. But he was, here's a picture of him here. And once again, you can see how this is so different from the previous pictures we have. These people, these pictures we have, you've seen some pictures pointing at the letters, at writing, and there still are some similarities in the way they're dressed and stuff, but it's just the age of enlightenment and the focus on writing and change. But he was a Mohegan Native American, and he converted to Christianity, and he was a minister among the various tribes. So this is interesting to see different types of backgrounds and Native Americans adapting to Christianity or something. We've obviously seen different types of writing in that sense, and the way people, some of the colonists would support a lot of the Native American cause, and it's important to see some of the fact that there's a lot of integration happening, there's a lot of rebellion happening, and this is one of those different strands there. So we can see how he was converted to Christianity, and he was a minister, went back to the tribes. But he, in this, I think it's a 10-page document, he explained some of the difficulties that he had. And he explains here, "But I can assure them that I have endeavored to teach them as well as I know how. But I must say I believe it is because I am a poor Indian. I can't help that God has made me so. I did not make myself so." So, we can see the idea here of it's a writer that's recognized, just in the past 20 or 30 years this document showed up, but it's important to see how a person reflects on their existence and their contribution to, the role of being, their calling in life. And he was a minister, and this reflects some of that. So here we've got a fellow with a French name, Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur. So he wrote letters from an American farmer in 1782. And, once again, we see the scientific aspect of this, because the letters describe the botany of America, a lot of the, flora and fauna of the Americas, and But he wrote about the conditions in which the settlers lived. Here's a picture of him here. But this is, we're moving into this phase here of slavery, and he denounces slavery, and you can see, a lot of his connections here with, Africans, and his connection here with Native Americans, and how he intervened in this sense, and he observed from, he observed and made these observations about America. He wrote about the Revolutionary War and how he felt things were beyond his control, and how he wanted to run away and live with the Native Americans until the war passed. Another contributor to American Letters, always interesting to see perspectives of people from inside, people from outside, and perspectives of different groups represented in the United States. Thomas Paine, we've got one of the founding fathers. You can see he immigrated to America when he was into his 30s. Picture of him here. And just to think that, when you're that old, you can move to a different place and have such an influence on the revolutionary cause here. She was very influenced by the idea of change and revolutionary cause. He published a short text entitled Common Sense in 1776, which sold some 100,000 copies. And it was most likely one of the first works to directly ask for independence from Great Britain. I think it was written anonymously. He tried to write it anonymously at first, but because of the fame it had, he was quickly discovered. And it was written in plain language, so it was easily accessible to all. We've seen how a couple of texts have been written in plain language. It's not a matter of trying to be as intellectual as you can. You have to think about when you write, are you writing, if you can't convince them, confuse them. Obviously, that seems to be the way with a lot of the writers in the world. But when you write with this accessible language, it's written for other people, because the point is, as we saw with Plymouth Plantation, when that was written with accessible, simple language, it was written for the people, so they would come to the New World. And he also writes this. He's not writing it so his colleagues can say, hey, wow, that's a really impressive text, but he's writing it for the people, so the people will follow the ideas, the people will understand what he's writing about, and he'll get some collaboration on these revolutionary ideas, and hopefully a change would come about. So this is a section he wrote on monarchy and hereditary succession. Let's just take a look at what he wrote here, and we can get some of his ideas about the monarchy. Remember, the monarchy would be obviously the British Empire, and he's looking for ideas of independence here. So monarchy is ranked in Scripture as one of the sins of the Jews, for which a curse and reserve is denounced against them. The history of that transaction is worth attending to. So yeah, like I said, he's denouncing a lot of the ills of the throne here, and he's looking for the independence. And notice that year there, 1776, which is important, the year in which that document was published. He also wrote Rights of Man, 1791, and The Age of Reason in 1794. The first one showed his support for the French Revolution. And actually, he was jailed in France for a spell when he was over there. The French Revolution, 1789, I believe, and some years after ours. But he was very involved in this idea of independence. And then The Age of Reason, 1794, in which he promoted deism and criticized organized religion in the church as an institution. And we talked about this idea of deism, which is, mentioned it starting with Abraham Lincoln. And it's really interesting because this idea of the Enlightenment, keep making the connection between the idea of objectivity, moving away from the Bible, moving away from traditional thought, and moving more into the idea of age, of autonomy, personal thought, thinking about with reason and enlightenment. and how can we connect these things to our thoughts. And he explicitly pointed this in there in his text. And the date there, is, you can see, is a little bit later on. So obviously the idea is after the revolution, after he experienced a lot of these thoughts, he wanted to create this document to explicitly point out a lot of these views on the Enlightenment. Then we've got Thomas Jefferson. Can't leave him out. So he wrote the Declaration of Independence, but Congress edited parts of it. He wrote the original document, and it was edited so many times. I think he was frustrated by that, but his, the Declaration of Independence is, the founding established group document that helped the United States become what it is today. He was also the third president of the U.S. Here's a picture of him here. You may have seen that portrait before. So he also founded the University of Virginia. Very interesting, and one of the great universities today. To see that contribution of, somebody that, was so important in the development of the United States. And his personal library was the foundation of the Library of Congress. To see this, the Library of Congress and the University of Virginia, obviously over history we're moving away from just everything focused around Boston. Now we're moving down south, we're spreading the United States out. But the contributions of these founding fathers to the letters in terms of not just establishing the importance of documents or thoughts on the self and the state, but also just on education in general. Just founding the University of Virginia and his having such a vast library to be the basis of the Library of Congress really shows how the Enlightenment and intellectualism was important for this era. So just want to remind you one more time, please go through and make sure that you review all this in greater depth. Take a look at some of the supplementary readings. Do some more research on some of these writers that I've mentioned, and we'll move on to the next section.